He shuffled through the diner doors just after midnight, clothes torn, beard unkempt, carrying nothing but a weathered backpack that had seen better decades. The late-night crowd, truckers, college kids, insomniacs, all turned to stare. Some whispered, others laughed, but none of them knew that the man they were mocking had once carried their freedom on his shoulders. Welcome to Story with Jorge. Before we begin this powerful story of dignity, sacrifice, and hidden honor, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These voices matter. Charlie's Diner sat on Route 66 just outside Barstow, California. 24 hours, 7 days a week, it served coffee that could wake the dead and pie that made truckers detour 50 miles out of their way. The red vinyl booths had seen everything: first dates, last fights, business deals, and broken dreams. But on this particular Tuesday night, they were about to witness something that would change everyone who saw it. At 12:17 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. The man who entered moved slowly, deliberately, like every step required negotiation with pain. His jeans were patched with duct tape, his jacket hung loose on a frame that had once been powerful, and his boots, military issue, though few would notice, were held together with wire and hope. The diner wasn't crowded, but every occupied table fell silent. A trucker named Big Jim nudged his buddy and snorted, "Look what the cat dragged in." A group of college kids in the corner booth started taking pictures, whispering about crazy homeless guy. The night manager, a thin man named Steve, looked up from his paperwork and sighed audibly. The homeless man, his name was Thomas, though no one had bothered to ask, found a seat at the counter, far from the other customers. He moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to make himself small, to occupy as little space as possible in a world that had forgotten he existed. Behind the counter, Sarah Martinez was working her third double shift this week. At 35, she was a single mother of two, putting herself through nursing school one night shift at a time. She'd seen every kind of person come through those doors: the desperate, the dangerous, the simply lonely. But something about this man made her pause. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice neutral but not unkind. Thomas nodded, sliding a crumpled dollar bill across the counter. His hands, Sarah noticed, were clean despite his appearance, scarred but clean. "Just coffee, ma'am." "Thank you." His voice was quiet, respectful, not the voice of someone looking for trouble or handouts, just tired. Bone-deep, soul-deep tired. Sarah poured the coffee, black, and set it down gently. "You hungry?" "We've got soup." Thomas shook his head. "Coffee's enough, thank you kindly." From across the diner, the mocking continued. Big Jim was getting louder, emboldened by his audience. "Hey, buddy," he called out. "You know they got shelters for people like you, right? Don't need to be stinking up places where decent folks eat." Thomas didn't turn around. He just wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and took a small sip. The warmth seemed to travel through his entire body, and for a moment, his shoulders relaxed. "I'm talking to you, vagrant." Big Jim stood up, his voice carrying across the diner. "You deaf?" The college kids were recording now, phones out, capturing what they thought would be entertaining content for their social media. The night manager was walking over, clearly planning to ask Thomas to leave. But Sarah had seen enough. She'd grown up in a military family. Her father had served in Desert Storm, her brother in Afghanistan. She recognized something in Thomas that the others missed. The way he sat, back straight despite his exhaustion, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, not from paranoia, but from training. The way he positioned himself with clear lines of sight to both exits. "Sir," she said quietly, leaning across the counter, "don't mind them. You're welcome here." Thomas looked up at her, and for the first time she saw his eyes clearly. They were blue, piercing, and held depths that spoke of things seen and done in places most people couldn't imagine. But there was something else, A flicker of surprise, as if kindness was the last thing he'd expected. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I don't want to cause any trouble. I can go." "You're not causing trouble," Sarah said firmly. "You're a paying customer, and you're welcome here." Big Jim had reached the counter now, his bulk casting a shadow over Thomas. "Look, pal, why don't you take your smell somewhere else? There's decent people trying to eat here." Thomas remained seated, but Sarah saw his posture change slightly. The relaxation was gone, replaced by something coiled and ready. She'd seen that look before, in her father's eyes when he'd returned from deployments, in her brother's when he'd wake from nightmares. "Sir," Thomas said calmly, not turning around, "I'm not looking for any trouble. I'll finish my coffee and be on my way." "You'll leave now," Big Jim said, reaching for Thomas's shoulder. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Thomas spun on his stool, his hand intercepting Big Jim's wrist with precision that spoke of training, of muscle memory that never forgets. For a moment, the two men were locked in position, Big Jim's face showing shock, then pain, as Thomas's grip found pressure points that most people don't even know exist. "Don't," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the diner freeze. "Just don't." He released Big Jim's wrist, and the trucker stumbled backward, confusion and fear replacing his earlier bravado. Thomas had moved with the fluid control of someone who had been trained to kill but had chosen restraint. The diner fell completely silent. Thomas turned back to his coffee, his hands shaking slightly now, not from fear but from the effort of holding back. Sarah watched him, her heart pounding. She'd seen that kind of control before, that deadly precision wrapped in desperate restraint. As Thomas lifted his coffee cup, his sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing his forearm. Sarah's breath caught. There, faded but unmistakable, was a tattoo. Not a bar tattoo, not a prison tattoo. Military ink, Special Forces ink. But it was what she saw on his wrist that made her world stop. Partially hidden beneath the torn fabric of his jacket was a chain, a metal chain that disappeared into his clothing. Sarah had seen enough military families to know what that meant, dog tags. But more than that, as Thomas moved, she caught a glimpse of something else, a small, star-shaped piece of metal attached to the chain. Her father had one. Her brother had tried to earn one. Very few men ever received one. The Medal of Honor. Sarah's training kicked in. She'd learned from her father that you never make a scene, never embarrass a warrior, never put them in a position where they have to defend their service. But you also never let them go unrecognized when they're in need. She walked to the register, pulled out a notepad, and wrote something quickly. Then she walked back to Thomas, who was staring into his coffee like it held answers to questions he'd been carrying for years. "Sir," she said quietly, sliding the note across the counter, "I think you dropped this." Thomas looked at the note, unfolded it, and read, "I see you. Thank you for your service. The coffee's on the house, and so is whatever else you need. My father was Army. My brother's a Marine. We don't leave our own behind." Thomas looked up at her, and for the first time since entering the diner, his eyes showed something other than exhaustion. They showed recognition, gratitude, and something else, the relief of being seen as more than just a homeless man in torn clothes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I appreciate the kindness, but you don't need charity," Sarah interrupted gently. "I know, but you deserve respect. And right now, you deserve a hot meal and a safe place to sit. No questions asked." Thomas nodded slowly, then looked around the diner. Big Jim had retreated to his booth, nursing his wrist and avoiding eye contact. The college kids had put their phones away, suddenly uncomfortable with their earlier amusement. The night manager had stopped his approach, sensing that something significant was happening. "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Mitchell." Well, Thomas Mitchell, what can I get you to eat? And don't tell me you're not hungry. I've got eyes. Despite everything, Thomas smiled. It was a small smile, but it transformed his face, revealing hints of the man he'd been before, whatever had brought him to this diner, this moment, this place where past and present collided. I suppose I could eat, he said. Sarah smiled back. Good. I make a mean meatloaf, and the mashed potatoes are real, not instant. As she moved to the kitchen, Thomas sat quietly, his hands still wrapped around his coffee cup. He could feel the weight of the metal beneath his jacket, the metal that had been both his greatest honor and his heaviest burden. He'd carried it through 3 tours in Afghanistan, through the loss of his unit, through the survivor's guilt that had driven him to drink, to isolation, to the streets. The Medal of Honor was awarded for valor above and beyond the call of duty. Thomas had received his for single-handedly holding off an enemy assault while his wounded teammates were evacuated. He'd stayed behind, refused extraction, and fought until ammunition ran out, then fought with knives, then with his bare hands. When the rescue team finally reached him, he was unconscious, covered in blood, some his own, most not, protecting the bodies of 2 Marines who hadn't made it. The medal came with a pension, with benefits, with recognition. But it also came with nightmares, with guilt, with the weight of being called a hero when he felt like a failure. The men who died, Rodriguez, Baker, Thompson, they had families, futures, dreams. Thomas had lived, and sometimes that felt like the cruelest punishment of all. He'd tried to make it work, used his benefits to go to college, got a degree in engineering, found a good job. But the nightmares followed him. The guilt consumed him. He started drinking to sleep, then drinking to wake up, then drinking to forget. The job disappeared. The apartment went next. The friends, the few he'd made, faded away as he spiraled deeper into a pit of self-destruction. 5 years ago, he'd pawned everything except the medal. He couldn't bring himself to sell it, not because of what it represented to the world, but because of what it represented to him, the last connection to the men he'd failed to save. Sarah returned with a plate that could have fed 2 people. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a dinner roll that was still warm. She set it down in front of Thomas without fanfare, then refilled his coffee. "Thank you," he said, and she could hear the emotion in his voice. "Don't mention it," she said. "Just eat." Thomas took a bite, then another. It was the first real meal he'd had in 3 days, and the first time in months that someone had treated him like a human being rather than a problem to be solved or avoided. As he ate, Sarah busied herself with other tasks, but she kept an eye on him. She'd called her father during her break, told him about the man at the counter. Her father had been quiet for a long moment, then said, "Honey, some of our best men come home broken." It's not their fault. They gave everything they had, and sometimes that's too much for one person to carry. When Thomas finished eating, he sat back, more at peace than he'd been in years. Sarah approached with the coffee pot. "More?" she asked. "Please," he said. "And ma'am?" "I want to pay for the meal." Sarah shook her head. "It's handled." "I insist," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small bundle of bills. "I may not have much, but I pay my own way." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. $15, she said, though the meal would normally cost $25. Thomas counted out the money carefully, then added a $5 tip. "For the kindness," he said. Sarah accepted the money, then leaned across the counter. "Thomas, can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Where are you staying tonight?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I'll find somewhere. Always do." "It's going to be cold," Sarah said, "and it's supposed to rain." "I've been through worse," Thomas said, and Sarah knew he wasn't talking about the weather. She made a decision. "I get off at 6. There's a veterans center about 20 miles from here. They've got beds, counseling, job placement, real help, Not just handouts. If you're willing, I could give you a ride." Thomas looked at her with surprise. "Ma'am, I couldn't ask you to do that." "You're not asking," Sarah said. "I'm offering." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with pride and desperation. Finally, he nodded. "I'd be grateful for the ride." Sarah smiled. "Good. You can wait here if you want. I'll keep the coffee coming." As the night wore on, the diner gradually emptied. Big Jim left without another word, avoiding eye contact with both Thomas and Sarah. The college kids left too, their earlier amusement replaced by shame. The night manager, Steve, approached the counter during a quiet moment. "Sarah," he said quietly, "everything okay here?" Sarah looked at him, then at Thomas, who was reading a discarded newspaper. "Everything's fine, Steve." "Just fine." Steve nodded, but before he left, he stopped. "Sir," he said to Thomas. Thomas looked up. "I'm sorry about earlier, about not stepping in when that trucker was giving you trouble. That wasn't right." Thomas studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted." Steve walked away, and Sarah saw Thomas's slight smile. Small acts of decency, she realized, meant more to him than grand gestures. At 5:30 a.m., as the sun began to rise over the desert, Sarah started closing out her register. Thomas had been quiet for the past hour, but not the uncomfortable silence of someone who didn't belong. The comfortable silence of someone who, for the first time in years, felt safe. "You ready?" Sarah asked as she finished her closing tasks. Thomas nodded, standing and shouldering his backpack. "Ma'am, I want you to know what you did tonight. It means more than you know." Sarah looked at him, seeing not the homeless man who'd shuffled in hours earlier, but the soldier who'd carried his country's highest honor. "Thomas, what you did for your country means more than you know. Sometimes we just need to remind each other of that." They walked out of the diner together, into the dawn light. Sarah's car was an old Honda Civic, reliable but showing its age. Thomas hesitated at the passenger door. "It's okay," Sarah said. "Get in." During the drive, they talked. Thomas told her about his service, about the men he'd served with, about the weight of surviving when others didn't. Sarah told him about her father, about her brother, about the military family that had taught her to recognize the signs of someone who'd given everything and was still paying the price. The Veterans Center was a modest building, but clean and well-maintained. Sarah walked in with Thomas, helped him through the intake process, and stayed until he was settled. The counselor, a veteran himself, took one look at Thomas and knew exactly what he was dealing with. "We'll take good care of him," the counselor told Sarah, "and thank you for bringing him in. Sometimes the hardest part is getting them through the door." Sarah hugged Thomas goodbye, a gesture that surprised them both. "You take care of yourself, Thomas Mitchell. And remember, you're not alone." Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter. It was from Thomas, written on stationery from a veterans' transitional housing program. He'd gotten clean, found a job as a security supervisor at a local college, and was working with other veterans struggling with similar issues. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "I wanted you to know that the night you served me coffee at Charlie's Diner was the night my life changed. Not because of the meal, though I was grateful for it. Not because of the ride, though I needed it. But because for the first time in years, someone saw me as more than my circumstances. You saw the man I used to be, and you helped me remember that he was still there, underneath all the pain and mistakes." The letter went on to describe his progress, his new job, his work with other veterans. But it was the last paragraph that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "I want you to know that I still carry the medal, not as a burden anymore, but as a reminder of what service really means. It's not just about the big moments, the heroic acts that get written up in reports. It's about the small moments, too. The kindness shown to a stranger, the dignity offered to someone who's lost their way, the recognition that we're all fighting battles that others can't see. That night at the diner, you served with honor. Thank you for reminding me what that looks like. Sarah kept the letter, and sometimes, during difficult shifts at the diner, she'd read it and remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply see someone for who they really are. As for Thomas, he never forgot the lesson learned that night at Charlie's diner. The medal around his neck wasn't just a symbol of one moment of valor, it was a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, and sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply extending kindness to someone who needs it most. The homeless man they mocked had indeed been a hero, but the real hero of that night was the waitress who chose to see past appearances and recognize the worth of every person who walks through the door. In the end, that's what true service looks like, not just in war, but in the everyday moments when we choose to treat each other with dignity and respect. Sometimes the most powerful stories don't end with explosions or dramatic rescues. Sometimes they end with a cup of coffee, a plate of food, and the simple recognition that every person has value regardless of their circumstances. And sometimes that's exactly the kind of heroism the world needs most. So the next time you see someone down on their luck, remember Thomas Mitchell and Sarah Martinez. Remember that you never know what battle someone has fought, what scars they carry, or what heroism lies beneath a surface that the world has chosen to overlook. Because sometimes the greatest honor we can give to those who've served is simply to serve them in return, one small act of kindness at a time. And that, my friends, is a story worth telling. What do you think? Have you ever encountered someone whose story was deeper than their appearance suggested? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Story with Jorge for more tales that remind us of the extraordinary people walking among us every day. Until next time, remember, everyone has a story worth hearing. Sometimes we just need to listen.